Welcome everyone to Enlightened Masculinity Podcast. This is the #1 show for enlightened masculinity on planet Earth. I'm one of your hosts, Yogi Chris, PhD. I'm the founder of Ninth Limb Yoga, and Ninth Limb hosts this hosts, is that how you say it? Yeah, sponsors this podcast. So you can find us on Instagram, #Ninth Limb, and Ninth Limb YouTube, Ninth Limb, blah, blah, blah. It's the brand. I'm also a PhD and a travel yogi. I travel the world teaching the Ninth Limb Yoga, and that's my brand. If you want to know more about that, go to ninthlimb.com. And this is one of a few podcasts. I have many books, and that's enough about me. I'm one of your hosts. The other host of this show, Akash Inti Katakam, is from Montclair, New Jersey, and he's a biotech research analyst for Big Farm. Very smart young man. And by young man, I mean he's just a few years my junior. And he's also a registered yoga teacher, starting his yoga following up there in New Jersey. And so he's a very spiritual biotech research analyst. That's quite a combination. So welcome to the show, Akash. It's been a week since we've talked with each other. And, you know, the last time it was really, you know, we're interviewing a lot of other people on the show. So this is our chance to really catch up with each other. And so I'll just kind of start off with what's going on with you today. And how are you?
Yeah, brother, super, super excited to be on. As always, this juices me throughout the week. Every time we have one of these interactions and engagements, I feel my soul rise to a whole new level. So I'm super excited to be here today. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, I guess, was it's no surprise that you're a PhD. And that is, in and of itself, a very long period of study on top of all of the prior coursework that you did in university and college itself. One of the things I wanted to talk about was kind of the path of the student and what it takes to go from student to expert in some senses. The learnings that you've had over time in terms of learning how to learn. One of the things that I've learned in my life is that those who can learn well and learn quickly are some of the most successful people, as it's a hugely important skill. I work with quite a few PhDs myself throughout the day, and one of the things that I've noticed is that these people are really good at picking out the important pieces of information from conversation or communication and are very intelligent in that manner. So I wanted to, I guess, delve into the conversation with you today, a little bit more about, I guess, some of your methods of studying and how you really are able to extract information and retain it. Another thing that I wanted to really dive into and get into with you today was what it's like to transition, or at what point do you make that transition from student to teacher in some senses. So those are two topics that I guess we can jump off with. Maybe the first one really starting on what is it that, again, as I mentioned, like what is it that enables someone to learn quickly?
Well, let's put it in context. Okay, so yeah, I have a PhD. So, you know, most people have gone through over a decade of schooling, and I hated school. so bad at school. I was so bad. I used to get really bad grades. I got tons and tons of referrals. You know, went to the principal's office all the time. I didn't like school. And I was bored. You know, I would get C's and D's in mathematics, but my dad went to the school and insisted, no, he can do it. Put him in algebra in 7th grade or whatever. And from then on, I got A's in math and got, you know, 6 college credits while I was still in, you know, high school for that. And, you know, what I found, because even through all of that, and then going to university and trying to be a physics, what do you call it? Bachelor's, yeah, a Bachelor of Science in Physics, and then aerospace engineering, and finally choosing industrial engineering. And I loved physics, and I would have gone with physics. It didn't work out with wrestling, because I went to university to wrestle. I was wrestling at the University of Oklahoma. That's the #4 at the time. It was the #4 program in history for wrestling in the United States. And that's why I went there. School was just a requirement to wrestle. And so I, you know, but I had misconceptions about what I wanted to do in life. So I just kind of went with this cozy medium between what am I good at and what is expected of me, or what's required of me. So I never had that passion or ambition about school. I cheated my way through undergrad, and I don't know how I passed. I don't remember much of it. And but I'll tell you this, about half halfway through my master's degree. So after my bachelor's, I decided I'm going to go for a master's. I don't feel prepared to do anything. I'd finished wrestling and I was like, I missed the college experience. It was just so much cutting weight and avoiding parties and being kind of antisocial. Even though I was like a fit young man, I never really went out or anything. I was like, I want to stay in school. That was literally my rationale for getting a master's degree. And so it took me 2 years. After the first year, I started reading. It sounds so absurd. I read my first book, everyone, at the age of 23. When I was 23, that's when I read my first book. And it was a textbook for environmental engineering, and by a guy named Howard Odom. And that man is what you would call my academic grandfather, because I ended up going and studying with his protege at Florida. So my first book, I read it. And what made me read my first book? Man, I loved it. It made so many connections. It made so much sense. I would look at the wind differently. I would look at the sun differently. It gave me, it reminded me of when I would read, there was this picture book I looked through when I was a boy about how planets formed and whatever. And as I flipped through it, I was just so awe-inspired. I never read it, but I liked the pictures. And that was one of the only books prior to that I'd ever opened. And so this new book kind of inspired that in me. I felt like a utility, like I knew something that other people don't know, but they should know, because this is great. I mean, when you understand these things, it just demystifies things like, I mean, this might not be your interest, but for me, I was interested in demystifying like electrical, power generation systems and wind generation and tidal generation, and, connecting how does the earth work, and how did living organisms evolve from the earth, and then how did people evolve from that? And it brought a tremendous amount of understanding on a subject that I was intrinsically interested in, I suppose. And so that's when I became such a student. I mean, Howard Odom, he's dead. He died in like 2001. But prolific author, dozens of books and hundreds of peer-reviewed articles. And I just dove in. I just had to, the way that he used language to convey these ideas, these rich ideas. I think a lot of people have really rich ideas. They just speak about it poorly. Did you see that wordplay there? So they poorly speak about these rich ideas, and it makes it unappealing. And so I just, knowing what I know now, and so I can talk about it with my current present time understandings, I fell in love with the man's language and how he used language to describe something that I was already interested in. And so that's I think what makes a good student. Like I think the student should be in love with how the teacher communicates, because that's how you're learning. You're learning through the teacher's communication. So I love Carl Sagan by how he writes. How he puts his words together is like magic for me. And Howard Odom was like that too. So I became a student there. Then I became really a dedicated student of Arash Dibazar and Vince Kelvin. And it was how they communicated. And even my Ashtanga teacher, David Garrigues, I mean, outside of yoga, I don't really so much admire his communication. I mean, it's fine. He's intelligent. He's yoga teacher. But when he's teaching yoga, his communication is it's what I'm looking for. I admire how he communicates and that's literally when I started to consider him my teacher, was actually through a YouTube video. I was watching him teach this other, a couple of YouTube videos. One was this guy and one was this girl. And how he handled the situation, the scenario, because the student was tossing up some objections to doing a movement or something like that. How he communicated in that moment is what sold me. So making that transition to a student was definitely admiring the teacher's communication. When you make the transition to you yourself teaching, I think it's probably going to be a similar thing. And I've never said it like this. I've never, I don't know. Angelica is on, my girlfriend. Maybe you can type something, your thoughts about what I'm saying. But when another person admires your communication on that subject, that's a sign that the people around you, as long as it's, a qualified candidate, it's like some adult or something. It's not, some 4-year-old kid that's looking up to you and like, wow, you communicate so well. That doesn't necessarily, unless you're trying to teach 4-year-olds, but whatever subject that you are considering, like its potential that you'll teach about, I think when other people start admiring your communication, that's when you would go for it. I'll hand it over to you. Anything else that I can answer for you?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And phrasing it that way in the sense of it's the recognition of the communication of the ideas, and that transfer of ideas really is really where the whole idea of study and such kind of comes down to. So you mentioned a few of your teachers in just now recently. I wanted to delve into each one of them, I guess, in terms of what it was about each of these teachers that in their communication that you had picked out from and really took away. So you had mentioned your PhD professor.
Lineage.
Yeah, your lineage. So there was something within his communication that attracted you.
Yes.
So I'd be curious, maybe we start with him and then we can go down the line with the other teachers.
And they're all so similar. They are all so similar, man. They speak a different vocabulary. They all each have a different dictionary, because the Hatha Yoga lineage of David Garrigues is very different from, hypnotherapy or Scientology or which, I mean, I'm not learning Scientology. That's fine. I think I am learning Scientology, really, but in a practical sense. And I think that's why I loved HT Odom's communication on environmentalism and environmental sciences, because it was very understandable language. It was very basic, but it was so non-redundant. As soon as I got into Howard Odom, I came across this mathematical concept of redundancy. And so mathematical formulation, which, any math, y equals mx plus b is a math formula. That's the equation of a line, right? And on a plot. And so there's a mathematical formulation for information where you can literally measure if there's a lot of information, a little bit of information. Let's say if I was measuring information on words, we're talking about communication. So I would read this document. Let's say it's 100 words, a paragraph. And you can actually measure in those 100 words if there's a lot of information or a little bit of information. Based on this form, it's a very simple formula. It just measures what the frequency of each word is, or the frequency of each letter, and including spaces and periods and all these characters. I became so fascinated with information theory. And for probably 3 or 4 months, I was just like computing the information of like everything I could get my hands on, because I would notice I was already a musician, like very accomplished. And I didn't realize, but I was already looking at music that way. I was so selective of what I listened to simply because I had this internal measurement, even though I didn't have like the numbers, the bits. If you've ever heard of a bit of information, that's actually what information is measured in, is bits, how many bits of information. And I would already be looking at music of it's something to do with redundancy. I didn't have the formulation, but that's what I was looking at it through, was that lens. It was just pre-formula lens of it. So I would read Howard Odom's, my academic grandfather. I would read his work, and I just noticed there was something so compact about it. It conveyed so much idea in just in what seemed like much less words than other people on similar subjects. Other people were just like dancing around it, or this man, he spoke with such certainty, or he wrote with such certainty. I've only heard a few lectures by him on audio, but his written words were so simple, and yet they would arrive at a very definite conclusion, and they were by measurement, very non-redundant. And this is a very similar feature that I saw in Vince Kelvin and in Arash Dibazar and in David Garrigues. The intelligence, which obviously if more information is conveyed with less effort, that's efficient, that's intelligent. And they're very non-redundant. I noticed early on, only now is Arash Dibazar circling around to like reteaching some techniques. But for years, 2.5, 3 years, I never heard him repeat a technique. And every now and then he might mention like the same word or concept. If he's referring to like, the mystery method, he'll talk about attraction or comfort or something. But as far as like a technical detail on something. It was very non-redundant. It was just kept flowing. And I even have some transcripts where I transcribe things that he said, or either by hand or using a software. And it's very non-redundant. And Vince Kelvin, similar. And, so to be able to convey, then there's this third variable, and I'll hand it back over to you. And I'm in love. This is the part where I really fall in love. This is like Rumi. This is like the lineage of Rumi, falling in love with the teacher, which, by the way, Rumi fell in love with the teacher, but the teacher was his soul. And convey more information. Good. Use less words or less energy. Good. Now, make it poetic. So, which would be magic. Make it magical. Because you can convey a lot of information by just talking a lot. Okay, that's great. There's a lot of info, but you're wasting my time a little bit. You can be efficient and not use much effort, but then you might not convey enough information. You might find that healthy balance, convey what you need to convey, but not use any excess moments or minimize that. But it comes across dry and not entertaining. Make it poetic. And all of these people, HT Odom, obviously Arash and Vince, and David, when he talks about yoga, like I said, outside of yoga, it's different. But in his yoga teaching, he has this, just like, you have to listen, like the energy. This is how he would talk, is like this kind of gesture. And, so that poetry in motion, or that the delivery was so entertaining that it gripped me, it gripped my fascination. And so that's what I would say about it.
Yeah, on that note, I mean, what were some things that you've picked up, I guess, from HT Odom as well as David Garrigues particularly? I want to dive into these guys a little bit more in the sense of communication techniques that you had picked up from them. So whether it be even your gestures, whether it be certain speech patterns that you use. One of the things that I've noticed as I continue to study more and more is that communication particularly, is that I'll realize that I will notice a gesture, a body gesture of the way I move my hands or the way I smile, what have you. Or I might notice speech patterns or thought patterns of the way my teachers will speak. And I take these because I recognize how impactful they are on myself. So I'm curious as to, for those two guys, particularly HT Odom and David Garrigues, what were some of these communication patterns that you had picked up from them and that you've continued to apply in, whether it be in your yoga teaching, whether it be in your silent flute program, whether it even just be in day-to-day communication, whether it be with someone outdoors, just some person, or with a girlfriend or some such thing?
Well, they were not communication teachers. And so there are some things I can talk about, like in their vibe, the emotional tone of their expression. And there definitely are some gestures that I picked up from David. They have a unique vocabulary, each of them, so it's very useful to grab David's yoga vocabulary and how he talks about yoga concepts like mudras, energy, prana, and samadhi, bliss, and all the yoga terms, Sanskrit. And with HT Odom, I don't use, like, even in the last silent flute lecture, I believe it was, I described Kearst geology and how the springs of Florida are formed, with sinkholes and water going under the limestone and eroding the bottom and blah, blah, blah. So I actually drew from, and it was an analogy to something. I forget what the analogy was. Yeah, it's in the lecture, but so it's probably happened a dozen or more times where I've drawn analogies. Even back in the Science of Peace podcast long ago, I talked about like how the sun is embodied in the wind and the rain, and the wind and rain come together with sunlight and some carbon molecules and make a plant. And so a plant is embodying sunlight. It's just a battery for past use sunlight. And then the animal eats the plant and the human eats the animal. And so humans are made of sunlight. And mathematically, that was my PhD, was measuring how much sunlight basically a human was made of, and all of these different resources. And I used it in many sense, I used it as an analogy for something. So drawing on, and that's how HT Odom would do it. So HT Odom would, start from the macro and just use very general terms kind of like in physics, they would call it like Fermi approximations. Just get into the order of magnitude. So it's somewhere in approximation of the answer. And we're not trying to be too exact. We're just trying to distill understanding from this. And so you see Akash sometimes he got kicked off to Instagram. That's why if you're on Instagram, you got to come to the Zoom, which is you click the link in the bio and you come to Zoom. But he's still here on Zoom. And, so I think that style of grab a very large general picture of, the situation, the environment, and just kind of chisel it down and use like analogies to get to, final conclusion. And that's probably a common quality of just effective communicators. When, I know you didn't ask me about Vince or Arash, but those are master communicators. Like HT Odom was a master environmental scientist and physicist and biologist and so many things, a bunch of PhDs. And so he had a communication for that, but somebody who is a master of communication versus a master of environmentalism will have a lot of his communication techniques in them. Like I hear what a common word phrase that HT Odom would use a lot would be more and more. So it's like, and the acid rain erodes the limestone more and more, something like that. And just that more and more. And the way he used it, it was just like, yeah, I get it. And later I studied from Vince that's a hypnotic pattern, more and more, like less and less. And let's see, anything else from HT? Like I said, I never met HT, although I met his grandson, I met his son-in-law, I met his widow, I met everybody else actually, except for I met his daughter. I just met everybody. I met his protege, his successor. Like I was HT reincarnate almost, because I was set to take over that department in the University of Florida, but I turned it down to become a full-time yoga instructor. So, and then with David, David has an enthusiasm when he talks about yoga. It's literally, I believe, saved David from, I don't know what David was saved from. David's maybe about 56 or 57 years old now. So, I mean, he got into yoga when he was like 20. So, I mean, I think he was almost a semi-pro, or he was like a semi-pro, so almost a pro skateboarder. And I don't know what got him into yoga, but the way he talks about it is as if it's saving his soul, like it's saving his life, like every day. And the vindication with which he talks about yoga it has lent itself to me when I'm teaching, where it showed me a vibe that I felt a certain way about it, and I would catch myself when I would like teach something how he taught it or teach a technique that I got from him. And when it was so recently after studying with him, and I would catch myself sounding like him or talking like him or gesturing like him. And so I created the vibe in me because I was just mimicking his teachings. So then I got a reference for that vibe. And if ever I am lost in the teaching of yoga, sometimes in a seminar and lecture, I'll just lose myself. I can just access the vibe and my communication will shift into that very classical Eastern teacher guru kind of mode. And so that's that. I got the guru vibe from David. And does any of these things resonate with you right now, Akash?
Yeah, no, this is really, really interesting because it's helping me to get a better understanding of who is Yogi Chris, or what is in order to really understand someone, you need to understand their roots and kind of the lineages from which they've come up from and been brought up from. So it's really interesting to kind of hear some of these in a bit more detail.
May I cut in then and say that the two main influences that came before that, and really one that's huge, obviously, must be my father. My original teacher. And not always, I don't want to say not in a good way, but though that communication style, it's effective for, how do I say, I don't want to say danger. He was an Army Ranger, and which is like the Marines of the Army. And he was an airborne Ranger at that. Which means, he could jump over land on top of you. And it was almost like a threat. Like if there's a threat or if there's urgency, he's very good communicator in urgency. and so if ever there's urgency, you'll see Angelica has caught it a few times when there is urgency. It happened when we were moving, Angelica. When you said that you appreciated how she's on right now, when you said how you appreciated how I handled our communication during the move, that was my father's communicating style. And so, but 80-90% of how he communicated is not useful for where I am now in my life, as far as, being, an entrepreneur, and, it's just a different communication style. But that has a huge influence. In a lot of ways, that's my default. That's my autopilot when I'm not aware of practicing my communication. If I'm not in control, hey, I'm bending my words and my tones to get a desired effect. A lot of times it will, over time, over days, slip back into my family communication style. And so every day I must read. Every day I must read out loud. Every day I must talk with people on the phone. It's sometimes text, but you get lost in your thoughts in just text. So text, of course, but a phone call. And then if I can, meet people in person, go out and talk to people in person. Okay, cool. So sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And just as we start closing up, I guess the last question that I want to ask you for this particular episode is, do you notice yourself drawing upon certain teachers or certain communication styles within your day, within your life, for particular purposes? In other words, have there been times where you've drawn upon HT Odom, for example, to and whether it be that energy of the way he talks? Have there been times where you've drawn upon Vince or Arash or David Garrigues or your father? And have you consciously noticed that this would be the perfect time to tap into XYZ's communication style in order to communicate this message, whatever the message may be?
I probably could do it more than I do. The most common would be Arash, and this is a similar thing that Ace would say about me. If she gets stuck somewhere, she'll be like, well, how would Chris communicate now? I do that with my teacher. I think, well, what would Arash say right now? How would he do it? If I was him, what would I say right now? I think I really have my own communication style because of my tonality. I think I bounce around and inflect my voice. I'm not saying I'm better. I'm saying it's just I zoom into my voice. A lot of times I have caught myself literally sounding almost like if I was a voice, like mimicking someone's voice. I sounded like Arash. I'd listened to so many lectures. I came out and my voice in my own ear just sounded like him. As far as accessing handstand nats, and I don't know your name, but I appreciate your compliment there, brother. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, like I said with David, when I'm teaching yoga, especially if ever I feel like I'm losing control of the class, which happens, especially with just groups of women, they tend to chit chat when you're teaching them yoga. If it's a workshop, if it's stop and go, they'll get off onto these little tangent conversations. I'm like, hey, bring it back. But you can't be too abrasive because then they get all upset at you. It's like, hey, come on, here, I want to teach you something. And so the words don't come to mind, but if I did have words to it, it would sound something like, how would David handle this situation? Let's see, do I ever access Vince? I do. So much material later, so much content and videos posted and so much time talking. I feel as if I'm starting to, I'm blossoming. I'm a late bloomer. I'm blossoming into, my own manhood over here. You guys are watching me become a man before well, that sounds weird. But definitely there have been times where I had focused on, let me elongate my vowels, or enunciate my consonant like Vince does. His voice is very highly trained. Hand gestures with my voice. And especially tone shifts. Vince has more blatant tone shifts. He really changes the pitch and the location of his voice. And I've even caught myself taking a knee to And like I said, it doesn't come through a lot of times in my head as like, what would Vince do? But it is something like I access the energy. Like I feel as if his energy would be well suited in this situation. And then I just become the vessel of that frequency and do as he would do. And like I said, with HT Odom, I couldn't even tell you what his voice sounded like. I know I listened to some lectures. I think he was a little dorky. But I mean, he had great language for what he was conveying. So from reading his content, so much of his content, I read thousands of pages of his content. And I mean, that's all refined. Anybody that's ever published anything on anything knows that you wrote 10 times that much to distill it down to that. So that's a lot of ideas. And it just came across with some sense of certainty, but not aggressive, just a very objective, almost like an alien, just like, this is the fact and blah, blah, blah. And then here's an entertaining way to present it. And therefore this, if you were wise, you would do this. And so I think when it came to conveying science, it just kind of infiltrates my awareness. I think, here's an example. When I teach physiology, a lot of times when I teach physiology, Ace knows this, and anybody in my silent flute program, when I teach physiology, the communication comes across, like how I talk about vasodilation and vasoconstriction and pumping blood to your brain and accessing your heart rate. The certainty and the confidence that comes across when I talk about the mechanics of the body, that is a HT Odom communication style. But the delivery, I must emphasize, is Vince and Arash. And a lot of it is Arash. Vince's feels much more technical. Arash's feels a little bit more organic. And I think they're both essential. It's kind of like the classic duality between Iron Man and Doctor Strange. You know, I'm fascinated by these characters, and I think that they are opposites of each other. They don't really like each other, but they both are essentially the same role. They're the same exact role. It's just one uses mental technology and the other one uses physical technology. And yeah,
brother, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting to just dive into a little bit more about who is Yogi Chris and what were his influences in the sense of how has he grown to become the man that he has. So with that, I want to, I'm going to close out on my end. If you guys are interested in any more of this content, highly encourage you guys to subscribe to our Facebook group. The link will be in the show notes for this one. With that, brother, do you have anything I guess you want to close on for this?
Definitely not. This is the new showtime, everybody. So, if you're on iTunes, then this is the showtime. The link is there, the Zoom link. It's 9 p.m. Eastern time, 6 p.m. Pacific every Wednesday. And of course, I mean, we've changed so many times. It could change again in the future, but we'll update all those show notes. And, Enlightened Masculinity Facebook group. And if you're on iTunes, then definitely leave us a review and, send that to us. We have our Instagram handle there. And I got a special gift for you if you do. It's a video instruction on how to feel good. It's a NLP process, and it'll really blow your mind. The people I've given it to were very appreciative. And so that's that. If JSO says, is this a Q&A? This is Enlightened Masculinity Podcast, brothers. Thanks for tuning in. We're about to grab a second episode here in a second. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next one. Blessings.